Hello, everyone. Hello, Mr. Colin. Today, our guest is one of the famous and one of the best teachers and writers of English language and English literature that I know of, and he's Mr. Colin. He's a professor at Kyiv University, located in Fergana, and he has international experience with traveling and working around more than 100 countries, I believe. Yes?
I've travelled to over 100 countries. I don't think I could have claimed to have worked in
Yeah,
all of them.
sure. But the international experience, it's there. Okay, so can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, that's always a question that's fraught with difficulties. I'm being told to put my microphone on. Because I think you're always in danger of giving a bit too much information rather than too little.
Sure.
I studied classics at Oxford, which is a very traditional degree, as you might expect: Latin, Greek, ancient history, literature, philosophy. And then I went into law, and I got quite bored eventually, being a lawyer.
I can see why.
Yes. So I decided to go into teaching instead. I went, first of all, into school teaching, but then I thought I would like to work in a university. I went back to university to get, first of all, a second master's degree and then a PhD. At St Andrews in Scotland. And I've taught in universities in China quite a few times, Korea and Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and now in Uzbekistan.
That's great introduction, and I think it's not too much. It's really to the point what we are looking for. So, as we're in Uzbekistan, I think the question that might interest most people is about Uzbekistan and you, so the connection between you and Uzbekistan. So, how would you describe your personal experience? Did you go to other cities in Uzbekistan, or are you only in Fergana?
Well, I've been to Uzbekistan before, and my first experience of Uzbekistan was going on a trip along the Silk Road towards China. And so I saw Khiva and Bukhara, Samarkand, Tashkent. I didn't actually go to Fergana that time. I went through Andijan. I went to Kokand. That was probably the nearest that I got to Fergana between Kokand and Andijan, and then I crossed the border over into Kyrgyzstan. And I enjoyed my time here a great deal. I thought Samarkand was perhaps one of the most impressive architectural sites that I'd ever seen. And Khiva in a different way as well, because it was really very much my idea of what a medieval Central Asian city would have been like. And so I always had the idea that I would come back here for a longer period one day.
Okay, yeah, that's great to hear about Khiva. I have never been to Khiva myself, but I would love to visit because I see the pictures and the videos of that place, and it's really like, as you described it, it's like a medieval looks, and like not many or not a single probably high story buildings. So,
well, the night I arrived, there was a power cut, actually. And so it was really like going back into the Middle Ages. You had to wander around with a candle. And that was quite exciting.
A little bit disappointing, but it depends on how you look at this, right? Do you look at this like, yeah, that's one thing that happens usually in Uzbekistan, unfortunately. Okay, so talking about Uzbekistan, what are your thoughts on the state and trends of English language teaching in Uzbekistan? Like, how would you describe? Are we progressing compared to other places that you've been? Or are we doing not that good? What are the ways we can improve?
I can't claim to know a lot about this because I have only been in Uzbekistan for a few months,
Yeah, yeah.
and I haven't seen very much of it, certainly from an educational point of view. I teach at one university. I've been briefly to another one for a conference, but of course I didn't really see what was going on there in terms of teaching. So I can't claim to know except by sort of general observation, and it seems that there's an awful lot of interest. I see a great many language schools. I see IELTS tuition centres everywhere. A couple of weeks ago, I was actually walking along and I heard the two boys who were in front of me talking in English to each other. I was quite surprised and I asked them, do you go to an international school? I was not expecting
You were
to
impressed,
hear
right?
two Uzbek people speaking in English. And they told me, no, they didn't go to any sort of international school, but they were just studying in the evening at a language center, and they were practicing as they went there by talking in English to each other on the way.
So, what do you think about that technique? So, the speakers of other languages, when they're learning English, especially, right? Do you think it's good idea, or should we only have English as our language only in the classroom?
Well, I think probably total immersion is a bit extreme and doesn't necessarily work for everybody. And people quite often get a bit of a shock when they go to a country where nobody speaks their native language. But certainly the more you do outside the classroom, up to a certain point, the better. And if you're not in the linguistic environment, if you're not in an English-speaking country, for example, then the more you can do outside class, the better, I think. With the best will in the world, you're not going to be able to spend hours and hours every day in the classroom. So I think the best rule is to do it little and often, rather than try to
All the
leave
time,
it for 1 day a week or something like that.
That's true, that's true. And also, one of the words that I really like in English is exposure. So, as you know, I'm also a teacher, and what I tell my students a lot is try to associate English in your daily life. Do not only try to listen to English and speak English when you're in the classroom, right? So try to listen to music in English, try to find hobbies of your interest in English, maybe watch some Instagram pages or watch some YouTube videos. So English should not be only in-class activity. Try to get as much exposure as you can so that you just develop your comprehension and eventually start speaking better. Yeah. So I have read that you have worked in Hong Kong. Yes.
Yes.
So comparing to Chinese people, so overall, how are they better students or are Uzbeks better students?
Well, I think it's difficult to generalize because there's always a lot more differentiation within a group than there is between groups. Right? So I would say a lot of Chinese students are quite diligent. In Hong Kong, I was particularly lucky. I've taught in mainland China as well. And the Hong Kong students are pretty good in general. The mainland Chinese students who come to Hong Kong are very good because they have to be. A lot of them want to come to Hong Kong. And so we tended to get very good mainland Chinese students. And of course, they might very well have been more comfortable in English than in Mandarin, which was already a second or possibly third or even fourth language for them. So, the Chinese students were very good. Uzbek students, I think, again, there's a huge mix. And within one class, I actually see, I teach classes of 25, 30 students, and there's a huge difference between the top and bottom of those classes. I mean, this is why the smaller the group you could be in, the better, really, because if you're in a group with motivated students, with a small number of them, then that's the ideal environment.
Yeah, that the progress would be better, and you would also enjoy because everyone is like in the flow with you. They're just learning. Yes. So I have read the works that you have published, the articles, I mean, and I can see that you are really interested in the works of Shakespeare, Oscar Wilde. So let's talk about Shakespeare a little bit. Could we say that Shakespeare is the father of English language?
I think that might be putting it a little bit strongly. So this is actually an opportune year to talk about Shakespeare because it's the 400th anniversary of the publication of the first folio. So the first folio of Shakespeare's plays, 1623, is it 7 years after Shakespeare's death? Yes, about 7 years after he died. His plays put together in one book. Perhaps not quite all of Shakespeare's plays. Pericles, Prince of Tyre, was missed out, and there are several others which are now attributed to Shakespeare. But all the major ones, Hamlet, Macbeth, King Lear, Romeo and Juliet, the history plays, the ones with Richard and Henry in the title. A lot of them we wouldn't actually have if the first folio hadn't been published because they're not available in the quarto versions, the single plays. Shakespeare obviously contributed a great deal to the English language in terms of new words, new phrases, words and phrases which, as far as we know, were not in circulation before Shakespeare. But if you think of the three main periods of the English language, Old English, Middle English, and Modern English, so, people are surprised sometimes to learn that Shakespeare is a modern English writer. And modern English starts probably about 100 years, maybe not quite 100 years, before Shakespeare was born, in the late 15th century. So it's difficult to exaggerate Shakespeare's importance, but some critics, people of the Harold Bloom bardolatry school, I think, do so, because there were several very important writers who were contemporaries of Shakespeare, like Marlowe, or earlier writers in Middle English and early Modern English.
So can we say that he was one of the most famous representatives of his era, at least for the modern English, because of course we're not studying medieval English and Old English that much, yes?
Yeah, he's certainly the best known English writer around the world, and the best known in England. And he was reasonably successful in his time as well. They wouldn't have bothered to put together this rather elaborate and expensive book of his plays 7 years after his death if he hadn't been a successful and important writer at the time.
Yeah, thank you. So let's talk about Oscar Wilde. And I think a lot of the articles that you published are about the authors and the writers that try to challenge injustice, that try to challenge corruption, let's say, and also oppression. And I would think Oscar Wilde is also has done some contribution like in this regard, and especially about his views of China. I think at his time it was very stereotypical to think of Chinese literature and art like in one way. And how did he let the scholars, let's say, recalibrate the thoughts?
Well, when Oscar Wilde was a young man, it was fashionable in England, in the aesthetic circles in which he moved, to idolize and idealize Japan and Japanese culture. And Wilde started off doing this. In his early writings, when he was at Oxford, he tended to dismiss China and say Japan is a very original and beautiful culture. China is imitative and uninteresting. And he changed his mind about that. We could almost pinpoint the day when this happened, actually, because although he never went to China, he did go to San Francisco, which had the biggest Chinatown in the world, I think, at the time. And he went to the Chinatown of San Francisco and met some Chinese people, drank tea with them. And after that, he always championed the beauty and the depth of Chinese culture. Now, when he went to America in the early 1880s, this was when the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, quite extreme and racist piece of legislation to try to stop Chinese people from coming and settling in America. Of course, a lot of Chinese people were there by this point. They built the railroads. They did a lot of the hard labor, but increasingly nationalists within America did not want Chinese people there. And Wilde actually wrote to the president and told him that he didn't think the Chinese Exclusion Act should be passed, that he thought it was a very, well, I mean, I hope that nothing would ever have been likely to happen to him because of it. But yeah, he did stand up for the Chinese in America. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, that's a good side to take on when someone's being picked on and you try to show your respect and interest in them. So let's talk about coming back to English. Yes. Well, some very stereotypical, it might be stereotypical question, but what are the important reasons? What are the, okay, yeah, let's try to repeat this, reframe this. So why should people try to learn English, and how important is English in changing people's lives? Because I will tell personally, unless I spoke English, I would probably be working in Russia, in labor work. And English helped me change in a lot of ways. It helped me to gain knowledge, to work, and to travel. It helped me a lot. So what advice would you give people to start learning English or to get better at this if they started already?
Well, I mean, I certainly don't think it's for me to tell people that they ought to learn English. I mean, I think your testimony is much more worthwhile there. For anybody who teaches anything, you feel a lot better about it if you are teaching people who already want to learn. There are few jobs that are more boring and irritating than teaching people who don't want to learn something because you wonder why they're there. So I think I'm not great at giving advice, I have to say, but if I have to give advice, then I think I would always give advice to people who have already decided their objective on how they might achieve it, rather than trying to tell them what their objective ought to be. So there's certainly plenty of reasons to learn English. It is the main international language now. This was not always so. In the 19th century, French was the language of diplomacy in general. A lot of Russians didn't even speak Russian. They spoke French. Tolstoy, I think, talks about Russian aristocrats going back to the land and having to learn Russian in order to speak with the peasants on their estates. German was the language of science for a long time. So English has its day at the moment. This is partly because of imperialism, British imperialism in the 19th century, arguably American imperialism in the 20th century. So that does make it a uniquely useful language for traveling around. It makes it a language which is often used for international communication between people who do not share a common language. This is true even within countries. Sometimes in India, for example, you have 200 different languages, and English is often used as the language to connect to people who speak different Indian languages. I mean, I think your idea of trying to immerse yourself in English as much as possible outside the classroom is absolutely essential. Listening to songs, watching films, listening to podcasts, reading books, short stories, articles, if you can.
So, and let's consider motivation. Yes. So let me ask you, do you consider yourself a motivated person? Do you usually have this drive to do something and to get things done, to achieve?
Well, I think that varies. I'm not sure that there are necessarily motivated and unmotivated people purely in terms of character. I think almost anybody is motivated to do some things unless they are exceptionally lazy, and very few people are motivated to do everything they do. There were, I think when actors used to ask Alfred Hitchcock, what's my motivation in this scene? He would say, your paycheck. But that's what should be motivating you. I also heard, that might not have been Alfred Hitchcock, he tends to get quotations attributed to him. Another lawyer I used to work with would tell me a story about a baseball coach, whose name I do not remember, who, when he was asked how he motivated his players, he just said, I don't motivate my players. If they're not motivated, I don't want them on the team. They have this job that is a dream job for most people in the world. So I think, again, you either have motivation to do a particular thing or you don't. And if you're not motivated, either give it up or think of the positive reasons that you have for wanting or needing to do it,
like a paycheck.
And there's your motivation.
Like a paycheck.
Well, yes, it could be something as simple as a paycheck. It could also be a hope for the future to better your situation, to provide for your family,
exactly.
To be able to travel, to be able to develop yourself. There are many things that
I think one of the reasons why IELTS became so popular in Uzbekistan is it's just a piece of paper. And it's actually, in some terms, it's overhyped. But I think the fact that you can have IELTS score, enter university, maybe win a scholarship, yes, and just go abroad, I don't think anything else compares to IELTS in terms of how much it can affect your life. And I tell my students, IELTS is not English, yes, because IELTS is a very structured test, and general English is usually a different thing. And yeah, IELTS actually, in my opinion, is more popular because it has faster this effect that you can start utilizing in your life compared to just being able to speak fluent English. But what are you going to do with it, right? And except for checking Google and searching for information. If you speak perfect English, there is not that much that you can do. However, if you have IELTS, you can do like real life activities that take the course of your life to a different perspective.
Well, it's, again, I suppose IELTS is a way of measuring what you've achieved in a certain area, and you can't cheat on it. That's really quite an important thing. I think you can't you can't fake. I mean, unless you print out a fake IELTS certificate or something.
Which they are
but
doing. Which they are doing.
But if you have a genuine IELTS certificate, it does show that you've reached a certain level of achievement, and that's pretty clear.
Yeah, that's true. Have you met any students that have high IELTS score but their fluency is like suffering? Because in IELTS you can have high listening, reading, and it will compensate for speaking and writing.
To be honest, I don't usually know the IELTS score that a particular student has. Maybe I could guess, more or less, but I haven't really encountered that situation where a student has had a high score and then has not been able to speak.
Yeah, I know guys who have 9 from listening and reading and 4.5 from writing. That's just twice the difference. And about coming back to vision and motivation, the question I was trying to ask is what I do at the start of my class, right? The class gathers and I start teaching. We firstly have a little bit quick intro, like how are you, what's your name, and a little bit getting to know each other. And I ask them, why are you studying English? And they tell me, I want to get IELTS maybe, I want to enter university, or I want to go abroad. And I will try to make it more specific. I will say what IELTS score you are trying to get, or what university you're trying to enter. And they will tell you. Sometimes they don't, because they don't know. And I will ask, when exactly you're trying to get IELTS, and what's your desired score like? Having clear vision in your mind when you are studying, I think it's one of at least that was for me. I always had a vision of me getting 7. 8 years ago when I took IELTS, I had a vision of me getting 8 when I took it 3 years ago. And it just turned out to be true. So what's the correlation between vision and motivation, in your opinion?
Well, I suppose if you visualize something happening that you want to happen, then it's more likely to motivate you to pursue that goal. This, I think, has been a bit overhyped in some mental systems that I've heard of. I haven't really looked into them, but I believe there are people who say, if you visualize something, then you achieve it.
The secret, they call it the secret.
The secret, right?
They even have a book.
Well, if it's in a book, it's not a secret anymore.
Exactly.
But I don't think it works quite that simply. But I can certainly see that if you have a clear goal that you visualize, then it's easier to stay motivated.
Because you have achieved a lot of things, did you used to visualize, and do you have this self-fulfillment once you get this? Can you remind me?
Well, I don't know how interesting or how typical my own experience is. I certainly remember visiting, for example, the educational institutions. Oxford was one example. St Andrews was actually another. I visited St Andrews before I went to study there. And walking round and thinking, I would really like to be a student here. And I expect that motivated me to some extent.
Yeah, so you just walked around and looked at the buildings?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there are good educational institutions in the world which do not look very impressive, but you tend to find, Oxford and Cambridge, the ancient Scottish universities, St Andrews, Edinburgh, and so forth, the Ivy League universities in America, they tend to be very pretty. And so if you walk around the campus, you just quite often think, yes, I would like to be here.
At least for the facilities and the view. Yeah. Okay. What advice would you give to young scholars? Let's call them scholars because they are students. I hope they will finish their bachelor's, yes. They'll do master's and hopefully a PhD. And the people, there are not many of them in Uzbekistan, but aspiring writers, because you have a lot of research, information about them. What advice would you give to the people who are trying to choose the way of science and feed themselves and their family through this?
Well, as previously mentioned, I don't consider myself particularly great at giving advice. I think I'm better at random, ironic observations than any particular sort of earnestness in advising people. I would certainly say you need to have your own motivation to pursue study or to pursue scholarship. There are plenty of ways of making good living without doing that, right? So, and if you are bored and irritated by academic work, and particularly by doing higher degrees, by doing a PhD, I would suggest don't do it. I have never, to be honest, met anybody, I think, who said that they absolutely enjoyed their PhD, that they had a fantastic time.
It's a torture.
Right? It's something that you need to be quite motivated to do. And I don't think you can really rely on anybody else to provide that motivation. That's maybe not the most inspiring answer. If you don't want to do it, don't do it. If you are intrigued, I had quite a long gap actually between my master's degree and my PhD. I went off and did other things, and I only decided to do a PhD in the end when I'd found a subject that I thought really mattered to me.
And that was?
So I looked at Oscar Wilde, we've already talked about him, and I looked at art as a counterforce to nihilism, or as Americans say, nihilism, in Wilde's works and the works of the aesthetic movement. So I thought, it maybe sounds a bit pretentious to say so, that this was nothing less than the meaning of life. I mean, whether life had a meaning or not, and the ideas of one of the cleverest people in the 19th century, a key period for this sort of these debates and this idea. The best mind of this time, or one of the best minds, on a subject which continues to be quite compelling even today.
Yeah. Is there a meaning to life? Yes.
Well, no. But I think Wilde, to some extent, anticipated the existentialists. Right? So although there is not a meaning to life, you can give meaning to your life in your own way. Right? And you decide what that meaning is. I think that's about the best we can do.
Yeah, I agree. There is no universal meaning. You should create your own meaning and just follow it. Yeah, I think we can wrap up with this, and it was a pleasure to meet you, and I hope we can do this again another time and talk more about philosophy. I love philosophy. I read a lot about nihilism also, so maybe we can repeat this. Thank you so much for coming.
Good. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
We're done?
Yeah.
So, thank you.